Embedded in that question is the soft implication that tilt is something which is a discrete point in time or a discrete function. The fact is, it is going to be an ongoing piece of work. So in one sense, the fact that we have already achieved things like Orcas, the jet agreement with Japan and Italy and the UK, our accession to the CPTPP. So to one extent, the answer is yes. But to another extent, the answer is inevitably going to be no, because it's an ongoing piece of work, so it doesn't have a completion date or a completion point. It's about ongoing engagement with the region, hopefully for decades to come.
And so the refresh said that it had now been delivered, which made it sound quite final. So if it is a long-term journey, what is the long-term effect? So how do we judge this if we want to put decades terms? How do we judge whether it's been successful in 20 years' time? How do we judge if it's been successful in a year's time?
Well, I think in a very, as I say, in a very real sense, it has already shown its success. Our levels of engagement with the region are higher than they have been for some time. As I say, accession to CPTPP, our ASEAN relationship, the fact that I myself have travelled to the region, first foreign secretary visit to some of the Pacific Islands that I went to for decades. So it is working, it is happening. Ultimately, its success will be judged on whether in decades to come, a future foreign secretary is as engaged as I am and the ministerial team and the officials within the department are. So, like a lot of things to do with international relations and diplomacy, there isn't an easy, hard metric.
Sure.
But how we influence the region is important, and we are seeing increased levels of influence in the region. I'm very, very pleased with that, very proud of that. But as I say, it's an ongoing piece of work. It's not something you just do and then stop. It's like painting the fourth bridge. You've got to keep going at it.
So if we take it out of the metrics of engagement and interest that you've just set out, what's the meaningful effect in terms of British security and British PLC? Many people would say that the Indo-Pacific tilt is all about a recognition of the hostilities coming from China. So those didn't feature in your answer in terms of how we will be safer as a result of this.
Well, the focus on the Indo-Pacific is about all the countries in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just about China. Of course, China is a very large, influential and significant player. So it would be ridiculous to have an increased focus on the Indo-Pacific and not increase our focus on China. But it's not exclusively about China. If I step back to the Mansion House speech that I gave, which was predominantly about China, it made reference to the fact that part of this focus on the Indo-Pacific is about building long-term sustainable relationships, good international relations with the countries of the Indo-Pacific, because, as I said in the speech, the centre of gravity of both world wealth and influence is moving eastwards and southwards. There's no point in us trying to fight that. That is a multi-decade long trend, and I have every reason to believe it will continue. So it is in our interest, economically, in terms of security relationships, to make sure that we have really strong, long-term embedded relations with the country, and indeed the individuals of that region. That's what we set about doing. Sure. We've got some early wins, let's say, both in terms of trade, security, Orcas, FCAS, but also there'll be slower, less easily measurable wins as well.
So if I reverse it, what would be a sign of failure in 10 years' time?
I intend not to fail.
I would love to say that our approach with China over the last 10 years had adopted that, but the problem with the golden era is that we thought that by opening up and showing market democracy and showing market economies, that China would see our way of life and go, wow, I wish we'd adopt that. They didn't, and there was no plan B for if that failed. Yeah. So what's our plan B if the Indo-Pacific tilt doesn't work? But also, what does failure look like, and what are we doing to prevent that?
So again, it's one of these things whereby, because this is an ongoing piece of work, I think we would have failed if we lost interest in that region, reverted to the kind of comfort blanket relationships that are perhaps easy to manage, easy to maintain. If we just crumpled back into just being, I don't know, exclusively a G7 focused country, I think that would be an error. I think if we were to fail to recognise this is an enduring piece of work that's going to require us to evolve our relationships, adapt our relationships, that would be a failure. If we try to harvest the benefits too quickly or too transactionally, I think that will be a failure. So having the respect to the countries of the region to know that they would want from us continuity and predictability for decades to come. Take China for an example. China measures its history in millennia, not centuries, millennia. So if we are not consistent over at least decades, it just looks as if we're a hamster in a wheel. And that's why I think we need to have both the self-confidence to say we're a significant player and these countries do want to engage with us, and they will want to engage with us for decades to come.
Sure. I don't disagree, but I think the focus very much in that vision that you're setting out for us is about relationships and engagement. Where's the hard edge KPIs the Indo-Pacific tilt? Relationships
engagement is hard edge. I really push back on the idea that somehow diplomacy, developing international relations, developing multi-decade long relationships is somehow the soft side of what we do. That is a really important function. It is hard power.
But no one's saying it's not important, but what we're saying is when you are doing programming in the Foreign Office, you say the hard edge effect we want to achieve is a reduction in drug smuggling. We want to not see the invasion of Taiwan. We want to see less efforts by the Chinese government to undermine multilaterals or insert their civil servants. Where are the kind of harder, if you wish, then rather than hard edge KPIs?
Well, I think there is a balance to be struck, because one of the risks is that if you try and push for KPIs that are too short term in your goal, you fall straight into that I think erroneous belief that this is all stuff that plays out over the course of weeks or months. And as I say, when we're dealing with India, for example, which has a history and a culture, again, that reaches back millennia. China views itself in millennia. What we don't want to do, what we must never do, is allow ourselves to be painted by our detractors as being short-termist and transactional, because if that perception is allowed to be embedded, then it undermines our ability to develop those long-term, really meaningful relations. So we do have to be careful. Now, we are about delivery. As I say, Orcas is a deliverable. CPTPP is a deliverable. ASEAN dialogue status is a deliverable. Trade deals are deliverable. So we are making sure that we have regular milestones on this journey. But we've got to think long term. We've got to think long game, because that's what the countries of this region do and do very, very well. And we need to calibrate our pace to theirs, rather than, I think, perhaps arrogantly dictating that they calibrate their pace to us.
I agree, and that's exactly the point I made about the failures of the last decade. But I would just caution, if we don't know what failure looks like, and if we haven't worked out what we're trying to deter, the risk is that we fail to stop those from happening. Final two questions before I go to Bob. If we have tilted to the Indo-Pacific, why has there been no meaningful increase in CSSF funding to the Indo-Pacific? It's gone up by only £2 million. That's not a big increase, to 11 million. Every other geographical CSSF pot is tens of millions, and the Indo-Pacific is 11 million.
Well, that is one of the tools at our disposal. Certainly not the only tool. So some of it is over the past few years, we've increased our diplomatic footprint in that region. That's an incredibly important part of it. We don't have as much money as we would like. I find me a Secretary of State that wouldn't prefer more money to play with. And so CSSF funding is a useful tool, but it's not the exclusive tool.
But do you accept that's a bit of an anomaly? Well, that's our operational funding arm. You know, when you want to deliver programs about security and stability, that is the pot you go to, and there isn't an alternative to it.
Yes, but for a lot of the countries in this region, they don't need our money. They don't need or want our money.
Oh, it's not about giving. It's not like ODA. It's not about giving them money. It's about us operationalising and delivering effects. Sometimes without the host country knowing.
But the delivery of effect is discharged through our diplomatic network. So our ambassadors, our defence attachés, our trade envoys, our the Home Office teams embedded in our embassies around the world. They are delivering effect, and they are delivering effect every day. And the nature of the countries in that part of the world means that a number of them don't need the same things that, for example, Africa might need, or the Western Balkans might need. So comparing something like CSSF, which skews itself towards certain types of interaction, isn't, as I say, it's not inappropriate, but it doesn't show the whole picture.
We'll agree to disagree on that one. Very finally, before I turn to Bob, we've been very critical in this committee that the tilt was a tilt away from the Middle East. Perhaps the use of the word tilt in retrospect wasn't the right one to use, because you have to tilt away from something to tilt towards something. The Middle East has historic commitments the UK should be upholding. Do you think it's a fair challenge?
I think the use of the word, I will take on board the use of the word does imply a tilt to, and therefore by definition a tilt away. And this was something in the first iteration of the IR, as the Minister for the responsibility for our relations in the Middle East. That was raised with me. I've never been a big fan of the word tilt. It's a useful enough word, and I can't think of frankly a better word. But it does imply a zero-sum game, and that is an error, because we don't view it as a zero-sum game. I've had extensive interactions with a number of the Middle Eastern interlocutors that I got to know when I was the regional minister. So, for example, during our evacuation exercise, operation from Sudan, I was speaking with my Saudi opposite number on not quite a daily basis, multiple times a week. Yeah. So it is as well as rather than instead of. We don't regard it as.
Although, can I challenge on that? Because obviously you mentioned in why the Indo-Pacific tilt has been a success, your many visits to the region. As Foreign Secretary, have you visited the Middle East?
Yes, I've been to Qatar, I've been to Bahrain, and as I say, I've had bilateral meetings. We've one of the, I suppose, because of the sad death of Her Majesty the Queen, I've had a lot of opportunity to host inward visits from the region, and more celebratory. So I've had quite a lot of FaceTime with my interlocutors in the region. I'll be honest with you, and I've had this conversation with them as well, I'm conscious of the fact that having been the minister for that region, having visited the region extensively when I was a regional minister, there were other parts of the world that I needed to get to know a little bit better. Hence my recent visit to Latin America, my visit to the Pacific Islands, two areas that I did not know previously. But I do maintain, both face-to-face and through digital communications, a strong relationship with the region.
Bob.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thanks for being here, Foreign Secretary. Look, I mean, I get what you're saying. No one is saying that we should crumple back, and it's vital that clearly that our alliances for the 21st century, especially in the Indo-Pacific, are going to be with allies such as Korea, Japan, as well as major states such as India and traditional states, Australia. And CTPPP, if I get the acronym right, and Orcas, I think they're brilliant successes, so many congratulations. What frustrates me still is some of the flaws, I'm afraid, I hear in your argument over China. You are right to say that these people talk in decades. I think that is a truism, if not a cliche. But actually, I think we are still remarkably inconsistent, and it's that I'd like to briefly talk to you about. I'm really confused by our China policy, which seems to me the political version of a push me, pull you. That on one hand, we see it as a threat. On one hand, Xi is talking openly about being ready to invade Taiwan by, 2027. We see China, in the Made in China policy, wanting greater independence from the rest of the world, whilst we are at the same time, whilst it is at the same time encouraging a greater dependency on China itself from us and other states. And so just looking at supply chains, and China is a really big issue, but we haven't got time to talk about all of it maybe today. So just looking at supply chain dependency, I just find the government's disinterest in our increasing dependency on supply chains, whether it's incredibly trivial and unimportant things like 83% apparently of our Christmas trees come from China. I'm not going to lose any sleep about that. But on stuff like cellular modules, on stuff like all the machinery of green technologies, we are becoming increasingly dependent on one country. I wouldn't like it if that was Australia or the United States. So why are we allowing this and not even questioning? So when people like me said, let's have a statement on dependency, let's look into this, let's try to diversify supply chains, I just get a sort of shrug of the shoulders still from government. Sorry about the long question. You
I
obviously
disagree fundamentally with your analysis.
Okay.
I mean, I gave the speech at Mansion House because I know there was a desire, and I kind of understand it, but there was desire to have a kind of a one-word definition of our assessment of or our relationship with China. And the point I was making is that we don't do that with any other country in the world for a very important reason, is because international relations are always more complicated than that. But the point I made in the speech, there were three pillars of our foreign relations with regard to China. One is we need to recognise the need to protect ourselves domestically from any kind of malign influence, from IP theft, from unacceptable activity in terms of supply chains, critical minerals, etc., etc. So that was one column. Another column was building load-bearing relationships in the region. That's a big part of what we discussed about the IR and the IR refresh, including with long-standing traditional Anglophone Commonwealth friends, but also with other countries as well. And then the third pillar was engaging and influencing and seeking to have a positive influence on China, using the good old-fashioned patient diplomacy skills that the UK is excellent at. So the fact that the speech ran through those domestic protections that we needed to put in place, I think shows that we have been thinking about supply chain resilience. We have been thinking about critical minerals. I've spoken on a number of occasions with African leaders, and I've said, don't allow what happened to Africa on coffee and cocoa to happen with critical minerals. Coffee and cocoa exported raw, the value add overseas, and the revenue lost to the continent of Africa that could dearly do with the money itself. I said, don't do that again with critical minerals. So I'm saying to African leaders, you should create an environment where investment can come into your country to process those minerals near the point of extraction, better for the environment, better for your economy, and doesn't leave you dependent on revenue streams from overseas like you have done with coffee and cocoa. And I've had those conversations with African leaders. I have conversations with the Canadians about their critical mineral strategy and their Indo-Pacific strategy. So I understand, I completely understand, I have a lot of sympathy with the concerns you raise, things we need to watch out for, but it's there in the speech that I gave on China that we are looking out for those things.
And I read your speech in China, but I mean, I'll ask a very, very specific question, is what is the government's fact-based assessment of our supply chain dependency? Because effectively the government has no assessment, has no requirement to publish an assessment, and apart from some vague sort of probably not great to be so dependent on China, what is our fact-based assessment of supply chain dependency? Do we have one? Does any government department produce one?
I don't know any government that does have that. I mean, and if I'm wrong, pull me up on it, but I don't, I'm...
Yes, government apparently does, according to him.
Oh, well, I haven't seen that.
Okay.
And it hasn't been raised in the bilateral conversations I've had with Tony Blinken about the United States strategy of engaging in terms of protecting but not decoupling. So the conversations that I've had with our closest allies on this, we are very, very closely aligned in the recognition that we are not credibly going to extract China from our or indeed anyone else's supply chains. No, we do need to have the safety that comes with having a blended portfolio. Look, I'm a free marketeer. Yeah. I'm never comfortable with kind of single source supplies. But the conversations that I'm having with our friends, both in the immediate region and more broadly, we are very closely aligned on this.
I mean, I know it's early days on this. We are making some progress because I think Alyssa's amendment has been accepted, so the government is going to be looking at supply chains in relation to defence. However, that doesn't include dual-use items, and it certainly doesn't include a range of non-defence items. So
cellular, everything else.
This is government procurement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
there's movement on that
because
tomorrow.
The problem is doing a whole economy audit on supply chains is an absolutely mammoth task. This is why I want to see what the US have produced and how much detail you can put on this, because the order of magnitude just in the UK economy, if the US have conducted an audit of all the supply chains in both private and public procurement, I'd be very, very interested in. As I say, I haven't seen that. I'd be very interested in seeing that, but it's not something I've discussed with the Americans, and I speak with them on this issue pretty regularly.
I'll send you one I did a couple of years ago. We found depending on what your definition of strategic dependency is, in critical elements of the economy, Australia has strategic dependency on China in 595 categories, Canada 367 categories, New Zealand 530 categories, the United Kingdom 229 categories, and the US 414 categories. I won't go into
So we're
further
better
detail
than the
here.
others.
Well, yeah, but we're still pretty dependent on them. And so I'm happy to send that because we have attempted to do it. But the point I'm making here is that look, the danger is that if China moves on Taiwan, either intelligently by strangling it or sort of Putin style by attacking it, if we then try to put sanctions, even if we're not engaged ourselves, if we are then putting the mother of all sanctions on China for attacking Taiwan, effectively, because of our dependency now, we will collapse not only our own economy, but in concert with others, one outcome will be the collapse of the global economy. Let me just finish the question. Therefore, the way to deal with this, a first step is to understand the nature of your strategic dependency on one other country, and then we can begin to do things to encourage states to diversify supply chains, to go to Vietnam or to go to Bangladesh or to go to India or to go to South Africa, or to bring home, dare we say it, some of this stuff here where this stuff can be made, maybe with less environmental damage. So the first step is understanding, and we're still not willing to do that. That's the point.
So I think you're rushing to granularity that's not necessary. If an avalanche is coming, you don't need to count the snowflakes. You know an avalanche is coming. And in the speech, I addressed the fact that disruption across the Taiwan Strait would have a catastrophic effect on the global economy, including China's economy, by the way. We are already looking at making sure that we diversified our supply chains. This is part of, not the exclusive, this is part of why CPTPP is so very, very important. This is why we're engaging with the countries in the regions. And look, if I were doing management, if I were doing resource management, and I was setting aside the time of my officials or indeed any other government officials, I think that we could do a degree of analysis like you put forward, and it would tell us what we already know, which is we need to diversify, and that's what we are already doing.
Right, so practically, what are we doing to get firms to final question? So finally, what are we doing to get our companies to diversify so we lessen our dependency and our risk on one very large, potentially adversarial state which is threatening war against another territory, or threatening certainly forced reunification against another territory, which will have the mother of all impacts on the globe, including the global economy?
So we have been working with regard to semiconductors, for example, particularly high-end semiconductors. We've been doing a piece of work across government on that. As I say, I raise this with our international interlocutors about alternative supply routes, alternative production. As I say, I gave a number of examples where I was having those conversations with Africa. There's no point in us turning around to the commercial world and say, and I'm not saying it would be an appropriate thing to say anyway, but don't buy stuff sourced from this country if there are no other sources available. So this is why we're working internationally, to make sure there's a diversity of sources, to make sure that we are increasing the diplomatic and economic cost of bad decisions when it comes to international aggression from whichever country they might emanate towards whichever country they might be focused upon. But none of these are immediate, none of these are quick fixes, and none of these things will be done unilaterally. And I can assure you that this is diversification of supply chains is an issue that I raise regularly in the United States of America. I've had conversations with both the Trade Secretary and the Prime Minister on this very issue. This very much is in the forefront of our thinking, and we are taking action in concert with others in the international community to address it.
There is a problem though within the system. So when I met with procurement officials well over a year ago for the first time, they did not think that national security had a role to play in the procurement bill. Literally, they're like, no, why would this have any impact? So there is a problem across the system. It took 9 months for them to recognise national security should be within the bill, and then another 6 months to get any sort of amendments done, which they've now laid some fantastic amendments themselves. But there is a systemic problem here, which I imagine Liam might lead us to.
I just want to check we're on the same planet here. Do you know what's happened to
Well, I'm on
imports?
this planet, mate.
Do you know what's happened to imports from China in the last year?
By the tone of your question, I would suggest they probably increased, but I would also imagine that, bearing in mind the benchmark year would be a COVID year, that is not surprising.
You got a sense of what imports from China are now?
I don't have those figures in my head. But
73 billion pounds.
okay.
You know how much that's gone up in the last year?
Well, as I say, if the benchmark year is a COVID year, it wouldn't surprise me if it's gone up quite considerably.
Well, they've gone up by 10 billion pounds. It's about 15%. That's how
Right.
fast our imports from China.
Well, as I say, that's
rising right
benchmark,
now.
but that's benchmark against COVID years. So actually,
20
if you look at trade across almost every country in the world, there's an increase if you're benchmarking against COVID years. That doesn't surprise me.
Well,
and I'm not sure it proves the point.
So
I think you're trying to prove.
let me ask why it proves the point. You read the G7 communique.
I was involved in writing G7.
So you remember the line where it says, we will reduce excessive dependencies in our critical supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell the committee what is the definition of a critical supply chain?
Well, it's on things that underpin our energy generation, our economic foundations. It's on the kind of technologies that we'll need for the green transition, for the full making full benefit of technological advances. I think these things are fairly well understood.
Well, we haven't specified what they are, and I don't think the government has specified what they are, and what you just set out would account for a pretty significant chunk of the economy. But I guess the question is, if our imports from China have just gone up by 15% in the course of a year...
From a historic low, Liam, from a historic low.
Well, 63.6 billion wasn't a historic low. That was a record high at the time. Are you saying that our dependence on critical supply chains has gone up or gone down?
Well, without knowing the mix of those, you can't tell from the figures that you put in front of us.
Well, they're the ONS figures, not my figures.
No, I'm not disputing the figures. I'm just saying you can't make the assessment without the granularity of what things have gone up, of what the rises are compared with the imports from others. And as I say, we're conscious that at the moment, in certain key technologies, there is an over-reliance, which we have, as I say, part of the G7 communique, we have committed to address. But if you're comparing changes in the past with intentions in the future, you're comparing fundamentally different things.
I think really my question is, you've signed a G7 communique that says we're going to reduce excessive dependencies in our critical supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to be struggling to define what the critical supply chains are.
No, we're not. No.
And we seem to be struggling to define whether the dependence gone up or gone down in the last year.
No, we're not.
Has it gone up or down?
Well, I've said the figures you presented don't prove it either way, because without
let me
looking,
put it a different way.
let me answer the question. without seeing the specific lines in terms of that increase in trade, neither you or I, just with the figures you put in front of the committee or that you presented to me now, neither of us can tell. The point I'm saying is the communique talks about the actions that we will be taking, and your question was based on what has happened in the past. As I say, you can't say a future intention is undermined by a historic. The future intention is defined by what's happened recently.
I'll put the figures to one side then. In the last year, has our dependence on China for supplies to critical supply chains gone up or down?
I don't have those figures to hand.
Okay, last question. Both Jake Sullivan and President Leiden have set out very clear plans for reducing dependence on China for critical supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
And between them, they're investing $1.5 trillion in making sure that there are stronger European and US alternatives. What are we doing now to reduce our dependence on China in our critical supply chains?
Well, as I say, we've got our
What's the plan?
We've got the critical mineral strategy, which I'm sure you're aware of. As I say, I've had extensive conversations with both the US and our EU interlocutors and others to make sure that we are creating additional paths for things on which we rely. And the point is that this is not a quick fix. It can't be a quick fix. All countries, including countries in the EU, including the United States of America and others, trade extensively with China. And we're all going through a similar process, which is making sure that we give ourselves and other countries, just as importantly, other options. This is what that G7 communique is focused upon. We have already started, but it is an ongoing piece of work. And as I say, a lot of these relative dependencies have built over some considerable considerable length of time. They're not going to be turned around overnight, and they're not going to be turned around unilaterally.
But they seem to be investing, and we seem to be talking. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, hang on, is that a question or a statement?
No, that was a conclusion.
So is that a question or a statement?
That wasn't a question.
It wasn't a question.
Well, unless you want to tell me that we are investing and we're not just talking.
We are investing and we are not just
talking. How much are we investing?
I don't have the figure to hand, but the whole point. But the point is.
Maybe you can write.
But the point is, the US and the EU are doing things in a fundamentally different way. The Prime Minister has made it clear that we are always going to be an internationally focused trading nation. I think there are some challenges with focusing so heavily on subsidies regime. Subsidies are less predictable. They're less liked by markets because they are less predictable than frameworks. We are producing, we are working on our protections in a way which is allied to, but not the same as our US or European partners. And look, if it was as simple as throwing money at a problem, that's what everyone in the world would do, but actually that's not what everyone is doing.
Bob, very, very briefly.
I'm really grateful, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. I'm really aware that these are not just pure FCDO questions, so thank you for taking them. I just find all this a little bit woolly. You're talking about excessive dependency. I mean, what's excessive? The reality is that dependency, whichever way you want to cut the point, dependency on China is rising. And a really good place to start would have been an annual statement of trade dependency on every and all countries, because right now it is almost too little too late, because if things get worse in the world, we are going to be in a position where it is increasingly difficult to do anything about it.
So I disagree with you. I disagree that spending the time and focus on producing retrospective reports of that granularity will help us on what we have already decided to do. So the quote that you made was from a G7 communique. So this is work that all of us are doing at the G7. We know the areas where we need to diversify, particularly in terms of critical minerals. We've got a critical mineral strategy. We're working, as I say, diplomatically, and other government departments will be doing their work to create a future environment where we are less dependent. But there isn't a quick fix. There isn't a simple binary choice. There isn't a switch that you can flick on and off. This is going to be something that we do multilaterally. This is something that we are going to be doing for many, many years to come. As I say, the situation as it is today has been built up over years, if not decades, and the changes will also take years to implement.
Chris.
Very quickly from me, the Chinese ambassador, as I'm sure you're aware, is banned from Parliament, but you're going to Beijing. How does that match?
Sorry, the Chinese, I don't see how they're connected.
Well, he's the ambassador for China.
That's right.
And he's banned from Parliament.
Yes. By
Parliament, which you agree with?
Yes. Well, ultimately, I agree. It's the Speaker's decision, and the Speaker's made a decision on that, and I completely respect that.
And you agree with it?
I respect that decision.
Why do you think it's the right thing to do if you think it's the right thing at the same time to go to Beijing?
Well, again, so I'm not the Chinese ambassador. I'm not going to our parliament. I mean, you're comparing two different things. I am doing what foreign secretaries should do, which is engage internationally. There is a very good reason that Mr. Speaker has banned the Chinese ambassador from Parliament because the Chinese state has sanctioned parliamentarians, I think some people on this committee and others, something I am completely opposed to, and I have raised the UK's position and my own feelings upon this in every single meeting and interaction I have had with representatives of the Chinese government. So I completely respect and agree with the Speaker's decision on that because of China's action against British parliamentarians. But that is fundamentally different to my duty as the Foreign Secretary to make sure I seek to influence, because that is my job, including seeking to influence the Chinese government.
Why don't you take Tom Tugendhat with you, for instance?
Because he's sanctioned.
So basically, China calls the tune.
No.
With James Cleverly, China plays the tune and you dance.
No, not at all. I really want to nail this down. The idea that a Foreign Secretary interacting with another government is anything other than my duty and responsibility is nonsense. It is literally my job. Doesn't mean I agree with them, and indeed, I have highlighted the sanctioning of British parliamentarians in every single interaction.
Well, why not say you want to take Tom Tugendhat with you?
Because I mean, it's not my job to take other ministers with me, and my job is to change and influence the Chinese government.
You've never taken another minister with you,
and that is no. I don't typically take ministers with me on international meetings. No. So the point is,
you're just a Chinese stooge. Then you just do what they want.
Do you want to give any evidence to that?
Yes.
Go on.
Well, I think I presented it to you.
Oh, well,
it's pretty straightforward. You've said because China has sanctioned some MPs, you wouldn't be prepared to take them.
I don't take ministers on visits with me. And that's not.
I think you know how shoddy your answer is.
No, I think you have got a nice headline that you wanted to deploy, and you've got no evidence to back it up. The fact is, it's the job of the Foreign Secretary to engage with foreign governments, including governments that we disagree with. And we do so to highlight the areas that we disagree, which I have done, whether it be on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or the sanctioning of our parliamentarians. I've raised this issue on every single meeting and conversation that I have had with representatives of the Chinese government, and will continue to do so. So basically, unless you can give evidence to back up your assertion, I would request politely that you withdraw it, because it is not just inaccurate, it is also, I think, really quite discourteous.
You had the chance when you came to the Select Committee previously to tell us what you would do about the actions of the Chinese representatives in Manchester. You chose to do nothing.
No, that's not true.
What did you do?
What we did was we made it very clear to the Chinese authorities that the behaviour of those officials was unacceptable, and those officials were withdrawn from the UK.
So you're telling us that it was because of your intervention that official was recalled to China?
I believe so, yeah.
And there was no point at which, that's not something you've said previously, I don't think, but there was no point at which you thought that the police should have been involved given the violence against some of the protesters. You didn't think it should be followed as a matter of criminal law here. You gave the Chinese the chance to take someone out of the country.
The Vienna Convention would mean that course of action was never one that was available to us. And the simple fact of the matter is we made it absolutely clear that behaviour was unacceptable.
Forgive me, though.
And as I say, the Chinese officials.
Forgive me, though. This committee is not of the view that enough was done. They could have been declared persona non grata. They left. They left. Forgive me, Foreign Secretary, but that allowed China to say that they.
I could have done.
Graham.
It's a very weak thing. Nice, quiet word in the background. It's a bit naughty, kicking somebody very severely in Manchester.
The officials left the country
because they were demonstrating.
The officials left the country.
Yeah. But you didn't expel them.
The officials
you just
left
had
the
a
country.
nice, quiet, cosy word.
The officials left the country.
But the problem is they left the country.
So what further? What further action would you? What further meaningful action do you think could have happened that didn't happen?
The meaningful action, you could have said that your behaviour is unacceptable publicly and diplomatically expel them for this country. That would be would have been the position with most embassy staff, I guess, if they'd committed a violent act on the street of London or Manchester, but because it was China, you took a very weak, cosy position.
The officials left the country. And
They made that decision, not you.
Look, you're
I'm
desperate.
going, Foreign Secretary,
I'd
I'm
say
going to draw a
this,
line on
you're
this.
desperately
Foreign Secretary.
trying to paint this as bad news. The point is,
on.
no British
Foreign Secretary.
officials were expelled from China in any kind of tit for tat response. Chinese officials left the UK. I regard that as effective diplomacy.
Foreign Secretary, the position of this committee is, however, they should have been declared persona non grata because, forgive me,
I disagree.
Foreign Secretary, because of the fact that China then spun it as they had finished their terms and were solely returning home to duty, and that is the problem. And if we cannot be strong at home, and if we cannot make the case that defence is not an escalation, we will be weaker on the world stage because you cannot deter abroad if you are not strong at home. But we are going to draw a line to this. The committee has made clear that we are unified in this position. You have made clear that you are happy with the outcome.
Madam Chairman, the Chinese officials involved that incident left the country. None of our officials were expelled from China. I regard that as a diplomatic win.
And many of them overstayed the deadline you set them, and yet there was still no repercussions for them.
Had we
that is what
PNG'd
happened.
them, they would have had a longer to stay in the UK than they stayed in the UK. They left the UK quicker than had we PNG'd them. None of our officials were expelled from China. That was good diplomatic work. I think they handled it very well.
But the reality is Parliament does not, as a whole, agree.
But
Saki,
it's
we're
not,
gonna-
for me,
we're
it's
gonna
not always.
pivot now.
For my actions are not always.
Foreign Secretary, we're going to move on. Saki, we're going to move to India, but I think this committee would also like to put on record our heartfelt sympathies to all those in India following the appalling railway crash that happened a few weeks ago. Please, Saki.
Thank you, Chair, and I echo those sentiments. Foreign Secretary, just want to talk about our relationship with India. How's the free trade agreement progressing, and what are the obstacles?
Well, we are still working on the free trade agreement with India. India is a large and complicated trading relationship. Actually, we have made good progress, better progress than many other countries have made with their trade relationship. It's not over the line yet, but we'll continue working on it. We have, of course, taken advantage of a strong bilateral relationship in a number of other ways, but the free trade agreement is not there yet.
India's human rights record has been an issue of great focus, including in Jammu and Kashmir. How's that affected the FTA negotiations?
So we don't typically within the free trade agreements put conditions on that are non-trade related. I know there have been calls in the past, not specifically with regard to India, but with other countries to do so. But generally internationally, free trade agreements focus on exclusively trade-related issues. Other issues we do bring up, and we consistently bring up, and I'm not saying just with India, but we do bring up other areas of bilateral interest or bilateral concern with those countries.
Well, if it's not through the trade negotiations, have these issues been raised with India?
Have you got specific issues in mind?
The human rights record and what's been documented going on in Jammu and Kashmir?
So we do raise human rights. I've raised both in general terms and specific issues with our Indian interlocutors when we have met.
It's also
The entire committee has slipped, so we'll
fine.
be breaking for the votes. Go on, Saki.
there's been great focus, of course, on India's continued relationship with Russia and post the Ukraine war, the large-scale purchase of coal and oil, and how they supported the Russian economy. Has that affected the negotiations and our relationship?
No, but I have raised those issues. I have raised those issues with with my Indian interlocutors, and I know that other ministers have also done so. We've made the case that Russia's actions in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world are completely unacceptable. That we're not comfortable with that trading relationship. Ultimately, of course, we don't have a veto, and nor would we attempt to have a veto on other countries' trading relationships. But I have made the point that Russia's behaviour in Ukraine and more widely casts a shadow over all relationships that Russia has around the world. And as I say, that's a conversation I've had with my Indian interlocutors directly.
There's been a lot of talk about the reliance or over-reliance on China, and of course the UK and India, you'll agree, both need to move away from that reliance on China. Is there any kind of thought given to a supply chain resilience initiative like we have with the UK and Australia?
Well, I mean, the conversations I've had with India is they are very keen to have a wider network of trading relationships, including with the UK. That's one of the reasons why we've been discussing a free trade agreement, but other relationships as well. They are very interested, particularly in green technology cooperation with the UK. So this is an area that I have no doubt will continue to explore. And again, India is the kind of scale of economy with the kind of energy and economic growth that would provide a good counterbalance, not the only one, but a good counterbalance to some of the concerns that have been raised by the members of the committee.
Yeah, I did. Just a quick one, if I may. Thanks, Chair. Is the action of other government departments one of the obstacles to clearing the line to a free trade agreement with India?
I don't. No, I mean, India is a large and complicated economy. Its regional government means that there are lots of voices around the negotiating table on the Indian side of things, and that adds complexity to it. It's a big prize, and inevitably, therefore, it takes time. All trade negotiations are complicated. The bigger, the more diverse the trade relationships, the more complicated they are.
Have the actions of other government departments caused concern and issues to be raised by the Indian government or Commission here, in particular in terms of education access and visas?
Oh, well, look, visas is a constant refrain from every country in the world. Every country in the world would like a more liberal visa relationship with the UK. Unsurprisingly, having business people, tourists, students come to the UK is a prize for every country around the world. So that is a topic of conversation in most of my international conversations. That's certainly not unique to India.
But has rescinding rights to work for students coming to the UK, paying international fees to British businesses, universities, has that been raised as a specific concern by the Indian government and Commission?
So the Indian government have regularly asked for more visa access, a more open visa regime. As I say, that's not unique to India, but they have raised it. We have had some good work on getting more students from India into a scholarship program that I announced when I went to India, of having very high caliber tech leaders of the future from India in the UK and Brits in India. I know the Indians are very keen to keep exploring ways of making sure that we benefit from the top talent in our respective countries. So, I mean, look, visas, student numbers, these are regular points of discussion, not just with India, but with many countries around the world.
Henry.
Foreign Secretary, is it the government's position to support Canada, New Zealand and Japan joining the Orcas sort of Strand B agreement?
Well, look, this is an area that sits across both defence and diplomatic areas. I know there is a huge amount of interest in Orcas from those countries. They're all slightly different. So, for example, Canada is not aspiring to have a nuclear propulsion submarine fleet. The New Zealand position on all issues nuclear is different to ours, but they are very interested more generally in making sure that we do technology sharing. There will be, and I'm glad you raised this as a point, because a lot of people think purely about the propulsion systems for the submarines. There will inevitably be a whole load, some of which have just not been predicted, not even slightly predicted yet, a whole load of other benefits that will spill over from Orcas. That's why it's such an exciting program, and a program that is multi-decades in its execution, and through its lifespan will have a whole load of other technology benefits, both nuclear and non-nuclear, that of course our partners internationally want to share with us.
And just further to that, is it the intention of the UK government to apply to join the Quad?
So this is one of the areas that we discussed in the Orcmin meeting. We've not finalised that. I mean, a lot of the relationships that we're building with the region are strong enough and robust enough that it might make that. It might mean that there's not a great deal of additional value. So I'm not saying no, but of course we need to assess it. All these things are time commitments in already congested diaries. And as I say, we're building very, very strong relationships. Sorry, we've got very strong relationships already. We're building on them. So it might make that obsolete. So we haven't made a final decision on that. And it wouldn't be just down to us anyway.
Indeed. And just finally, very, very briefly, what's the government's stance towards the regional comprehensive economic partnership and the Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity?
Again, we've got a number of projects, including CPTPP, that we've got to get operationalised. One of the things that I think is inevitable that we will, as we whether it be ASEAN, whether it be CPTPP, Orcas, as we get these things up and running and operationalised, I think it's inevitable that we will look at other regional groupings. I don't want to set too many hairs running, because again, it's not just down to us. We don't get to just say, I want to be part of that, and then we kind of turn up. So this will be negotiation with partners. I think the signal that we send to the region, particularly like-minded partners in the region, is our commitment to values, our commitment to high principles, high standards. This is very much what we bring to the party. Multilateral organisations and groupings that reinforce that, of course, we are naturally attracted towards. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to start saying yes and yes and yes and yes and yes, whilst we've still got a number of projects that we're operationalising at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Just if I come to Taiwan, just on the whole AUKUS element, it strikes me that the other pillar, the non-nuclear sub-pillar of AUKUS, has potentially almost sort of greater long-term value in the sense of broadening out to include more specific allies, Japan, Korea, etc. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Look, I think there's so much positive potential on this, and I'm glad. I mean, I don't think I'm going to say this very often, but I'm glad there's this line of questioning at the committee because it does give me the chance to say this is more than just about nuclear-powered submarines. There are technologies that inevitably will be derived from this that will ultimately not have applications within the nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarine program. In civilian applications and others, it will drive a generation of new skills in all three countries and probably others. It is a really, really exciting program, and I know when people think of it, they think subs. That is an important part of it. There's so much more to this, and it will, I have no doubt, have a whole load of positive ripple effect, non-defence related benefits as well.
Can I just ask you about Taiwan? What role does cooperation with Taiwan have for the UK's Indo-Pacific strategy, and to what extent is there a trade-off between close relationship with Taiwan and damaging our relationship with with China?
So our position on Taiwan is long-standing and boringly predictable. It hasn't changed. We have a relationship with Taiwan. We have a strong trading relationship with Taiwan. Our relationship with China is always going to have as a foundation stone our values and principles. It goes to the point that I was making to others. And whilst I don't think it is sensible to have rows and disagreements just for the sake of having rows and disagreements, where there are areas where we feel strongly and we disagree strongly with China, we're very, very comfortable airing those disagreements directly, which is why we engage, which is why Chinese officials come to the UK, and that is why foreign ministers of all countries also go to China.
Just before I come on to Ukraine, just very briefly, and you say you enjoy answering some of these sort of more strategic questions. Do you think actually with the Atlantic Declaration that's been signed last week, and with Orcas and the potential widening of the AI and the tech elements of it, effectively we're beginning to see a split in the world in terms of AI, big data, high tech, between China maybe and China's allies like Russia, and a sort of free world, and there is beginning to be that sort of cleavage between the two.
I certainly don't think that cleavage is inevitable. I think that the benefits of AI are huge, and we've discussed the implications that might have on trawling the vast quantities of historic medical data, for example, that AI might be very, very good at doing. But there are definitely risks that need to be mitigated, and those risks are not exclusively risks that the UK or the US or other countries like ours would bear. If it goes wrong, if it's poorly governed or ungoverned, I think those risks will manifest itself in China, in Russia, in other countries. So I genuinely believe it's in all of our global interests to get this right. And this is moving quick, so we've got to get our skates on, which is why I'm very, very proud of the fact that the UK is hosting the first AI governance summit. The US, this is something we discuss with them pretty regularly, and I'm very pleased that they're engaged with this, as indeed many other partners around the world are. This is in everybody's interest to get right.
Okay, just moving on to Ukraine, how sustainable are our current levels of financial and military support?
Well, look, they have to be sustainable because the stakes are so high that if we fail to achieve what we've set out to achieve, which is helping the Ukrainians regain their country and reinforcing the importance of territorial integrity, of national sovereignty, of the UN Charter, of the rule of law, if we fail in that endeavour, the downstream implications are so huge and so costly, both in terms of human lives and financial expenditure, that the commitments we have made now will be dwarfed. So it's incredibly important that we stay the course. This is a conversation that I have regularly internationally.
But we're not. It's true to say, okay, the US is supplying 85% of the military kit, and dominates the financial support as well. I mean, arguably, we are not sustaining the Ukrainians to the extent, and their argument that you hear from some Ukrainians that we're not sustaining the Ukrainians to the extent to allow them to achieve that victory that they need to do.
That's not the feedback. I mean, I've just come back from Kyiv. Had a bilateral meeting with the president, the prime minister, and the foreign minister. That's not what they're saying to me.
Okay, so we are sustaining shells, 155 shells, and indeed 152. So NATO standard and old Soviet standard. They are still being overmatched significantly by the Russians in artillery shells. Would you say that is an untrue statement or a true statement?
The Russian army in the field is bigger than the Ukrainian army in the field, which is why our support to the Ukrainians not allowing this to become a simple Soviet-style attritional slugfest is so very, very important. What we have seen is whilst the Ukrainians have been overmatched in terms of numbers, troop numbers, equipment numbers, and others, they have been much more effective in their use of resource, both human resource and military material. So that's part of what we do. Of course, we do recognise that we have to, both in terms of sustainment of our support to Ukraine and our own future replenishment, we have got to collectively increase the scale of production. Those, the plans around that are already being discussed, and those things are already going to be put into place. That is not a quick fix.
Yeah.
That is going to take time as we gear up our production. But I have no doubt.
Just on that point, why haven't we months ago given a contract to BAE to significantly increase 155 supply? It's relatively cheap. And it absolutely fills a very significant hole in the Ukrainian supply.
So, this is more a matter for MOD, so I'm not really able to give a detailed answer on that. There are a whole load of reasons, potentially, as I say, I'm not going to speculate, I don't know. But we do recognise that the production, as I say, both for the current sustainment and our future replenishment, we know that we need to increase military equipment and ammunition production rates. I would also make the point, though, that we shouldn't allow, I'm not suggesting you are, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to be drawn into this belief that somehow Russia's capabilities are bottomless. Our sanction regime is really putting the squeeze on Russia. Their oil revenues have dropped very significantly. They've gone into negative growth when they had been forecasting significant economic growth. We are putting pressure through our and the international sanctions regime on Russia's ability to wage war, and we're also making sure that we're applying sanctions, for example, to Iran, where they've been providing military support to Russia.
Just look at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. We've taken evidence in the past from people in the private sector and the difficulty of getting a sort of war insurance to underwrite their work or their sales or the reconstruction work that is starting already, and the Ukrainians are very keen to have reconstruction now, despite its obvious risks. How is the Foreign Office working with other bits of government to address this so we can get some answers for our Ukrainian friends at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference next week, because this is potentially very important and very important for our businesses as well as supporting Ukraine? Yes,
and you're absolutely right. We need to find a way of supporting Ukrainians both in the here and now. There has been an assessment of their immediate requirements, which is in the region of $14 billion US dollars in value. Now, I would make the point the URC is not a pledging conference. That's not what it's about. That said, I've been had conversations where I think there will be some pledges towards that immediate need made at the conference, but as I say, it's not a pledging conference. It is about exploring what reassurances the private sector would need to start providing some of that private sector funding for the reconstruction. Some of that will be war risk insurance. Some of it will be about what we collectively are going to do with the Ukrainians to make sure that once they've been successful in defending themselves against this attack, that they don't have a repeat performance at some point in the near future. So both financial products, support from the international community militarily, ultimately their pathway to NATO. These are all going to be parts of it, but you are absolutely right. We do need to find credible ways of de-risking enough to start unlocking the taps of private sector investment going into Ukraine. That's in large part what the URC is going to be about.
Thank you.
Thanks. I completely agree, obviously, about Ukraine and the desire to be able to get on with reconstruction. I wonder whether you can help me with a few things. You know that, obviously, that Abramovich sanctioned, the sale of Chelsea went through last May. Is the charity up and running, and has it now got the money from that to be able to start the reconstruction in Ukraine?
So we set up the trust to deal with this, and actually we've handed that across because I think it's better that it is dealt with and
the money
and been seen to be dealt with independently of government. When they are ready to receive the money, we'll unlock it. That hasn't happened yet.
They've been saying that they've been ready for several months now.
That's not what that's not the feedback that I've got. There are still certain issues that need to be resolved before that can be.
But it's a whole year now. It's more than a year since the sale of Chelsea, and that's £3.2 billion. That would be the single biggest amount of money that we'd be contributing.
Yeah, as I say, we've set up a trust to deal with this, and that is their responsibility.
So you're blaming Mike Penrose for not having got it ready in time?
I'm not blaming anybody, and the point I'm making is that this is complicated. The numbers are very significant. We want to make sure that the money goes exclusively to the recipients that it should go to. This is inevitably very. It's important we get this right. But
so
ultimately,
what's the thing that's not right yet?
But ultimately, as I say, the trust was set up for this reason. It's their job to.
What's the thing that's not right yet?
Well, it's important we make sure that the money that was released goes to the recipients, and exclusively the recipients that it was aimed at. That it was.
So you're not sure that it would, as it's presently constructed?
Well, I want to make sure. We want to get this right. And as I say, it is with a sum of money of this magnitude. I would rather get it right than to do it quickly and inadvertently get it wrong.
One of your colleagues said last July in the House, I think it was, that it would be sorted by the autumn. And now we're here the next summer, and it doesn't look as if it's going to be done by... Will it be done by the summer recess?
Well, I don't know. As I say, we're not the only ones involved in this. We need to make sure we get this right.
I think literally you are the only people left in it. But anyway,
well,
let me...
Chris, you keep saying this, that's just not the case. And you know it's not the case. Again, I know it's good for a headline, but it's just not true.
It is honestly... The only people who have to decide whether the money is handed over is the government. The trust, so I am told, is perfectly ready and has been ready for some time. So if you're not across the details and you would like to write to us later...
No.
So what's the problem with the trust then?
So why wouldn't we? If everything were tickety-boo, if everything were right, and if we've had all the assurances we need, why would we not handle it?
Quite. So what is the problem?
No. So I'm asking, why would we not?
You're saying that it's not ready for some reason. So
I'm saying that I want to make sure. I feel that with a sum of money this significant, we are duty bound to make sure that we absolutely get this right. If your contention is that everything is fine, help me understand why you wouldn't just sign the cheque.
No, I want you to help me understand why you're not...
I've just told you.
Well, you haven't. You haven't pointed to a single thing that you think is problematic with the present situation with the trust.
Well, the point...
And maybe you need to write to us to clarify.
Well, no,
that.
I can explain now. I want to absolutely make sure that the money goes exclusively to the recipients.
And you think it wouldn't as it's presently constructed?
And I need full reassurance that is the case before.
So you don't trust the way the trust has been put up?
No.
Okay.
No.
Let me move on to another subject then.
You're trying to put words in my mouth, and that's not what I've said. And again, I think it's really, really clear that we work with the trust. We are trying to make sure we achieve the same thing. It is right that we do it properly because of the sums of money involved. I want to absolutely make sure this is right.
I would gently suggest that it would also be good to be able to start reconstruction in Ukraine because there are people begging for homes. And this is a substantial amount of money and it's meant to have been ready many months ago. Let me ask you a different question, which is about... there are still British companies functioning in Russia, aren't there?
Quite possibly.
You would urge them to stop, presumably?
Yes.
Including Infosys?
I would tell everyone to abide by the sanctions regime that we've put in place.
And Mantrack, is partly owned by somebody who has a British nationality at the moment. It's still had a Russian-based website up selling Caterpillar equipment to oil and gas companies in Russia. Presumably you think that they should stop?
Well, look, I don't think it's right for me to dictate to commercial entities how they behave beyond our sanctions regime, which is explicit, underpinned by statute. So our sanctions regime is clear. One of the things that I would say as a broader point, and just as I said with regard to countries trading with Russia, I think people should be aware of the reputational implications of continuing to trade with Russia, but ultimately commercial decisions are for commercial entities. We have a sanctions regime in place. We are working to make sure that the sanctions regime is not contravened and that we work to make sure it is enforced. But our sanctions regime is what it is. And we recognise that that doesn't cover all activities. And so I would be uncomfortable demanding anything beyond what our sanctions do. Our sanctions demand, because that's what they're there to do. I have personal views on things, but ultimately in terms of government policy, our sanctions are clear and unambiguous, and they should be abided by.
So Mantrack is half owned by Mohammed Mansour, who gave £5 million to your political party at the same time as making money in Russia. Is there no reputational risk, as you just used the term?
Well, if he's abiding by saying, I don't know the details of the nature of the trade, and I'd want to look into it rather than relying just on your interpretation of things.
Will you write to us then?
If there's a specific question that you want me to answer,
I'm asking you, is it right that...
when you say right, you mean legal? Or?
Let me finish the question. Do you think it is morally right for a British political party to take £5 million from somebody who has just made their money out of Russia via Mantrack?
So the point I would make is that we codify our morals through laws. If you're suggesting that this individual or this company has done anything wrong, I'd be very, very interested in any of the details of that. But ultimately, as I say, our sanctions are the codification of our view on these things. We expect sanctions to be, we demand sanctions be abided by. And if you're suggesting there is a breach of that, then please let me know.
Well, my anxiety is that we have quite rightly sought to put in a very strong set of sanctions to cripple the Russian economy, so as to weaken its ability to fight in Ukraine. But there is a company that has been selling equipment for gas and oil companies in Russia up until very, very recently, and possibly still today. Certainly at the beginning of May they were, which is when I understand that the Conservative Party took £5 million from the person who half owns that company. And that, it seems to me, just seems to undermine the sanctions efforts that we're making. But maybe you could write...
So are you sorry, I think we need to be very clear on this. Are you suggesting there's sanctions contravention? Yes or no?
I'm suggesting that the sanctions regime may not be tough enough. I don't know
That's
whether
a
there
different
has
conversation,
been
but I mean, you're raising a specific case and you're trying to link it to donations to a political party.
As you know,
are you suggesting there's sanctions contravention? Because if there is, I would be very interested to know the details of that.
As you know, I've been arguing for a long time that our sanctions regime in Russia is nowhere near as strong as it needs to be.
But are you suggesting there's sanctions contravention?
With all due respect, Foreign Secretary, that we're the committee, you're the Foreign Secretary, so you're in a better place to be able to
I'm waiting for a question, Chris.
So I've asked a very direct question, pretty
Which is
clear.
what? Repeat it, because I've missed it.
My question is, do you think it undermines Britain's efforts to try and weaken the Russian economy and our sanctions regime if the British Conservative Party takes £5 million from a person who has been running who part owns a company, Mantrack, which sells and has been selling up until very recently I'm not sure whether it is still today, but certainly was at the beginning of May when the money was taken by the Conservative Party, that was therefore selling equipment to gas and oil companies in Russia.
Well, the point I would make is that within your question you're implying, because you're making reference to sanctions, the point I'm saying is that if it's activity that is not sanctions, I can't see how it could undermine our sanctions regime. If you're suggesting it is in breach of sanctions, then I think you should let me know. And frankly, the nature of the donations, I completely fail to see that's relevant. The UK government, Conservative-run UK government, has, I think, had one of the most robust postures to Russia in the world. I'm very proud of that. We've, in many instances, moved more quickly than others. We work in close coordination with others. So again, if there's a specific accusation you want to make it, rather than just throwing words out to try and link from what seems from your question to be legitimate activities. But if there is illegitimacy, please feel free to say so.
Let me ask you one final question about Russia and Ukraine, which is the other potential source of funds for the restoration and rebuilding of Ukraine is assets belonging to the Russian state that are presently frozen in the UK. The government has undertaken to come back to the House, I think by September, on plans or what plans you have in this field. As you know, some of us have been arguing, and some other countries have already started the process of seizing assets and not just freezing. I'm
not sure. Well, my understanding is one other country is exploring how that might. And the last time I was here, which was the best part of 5 months ago, that process had started. As I said at the time, we're very, very interested in that. This is There's important legal principles at stake here with regard to state seizure of assets. Freezing is one thing, seizing and disposing is another. Obviously, our posture is really, really clear. Those who are involved or have been involved and facilitated the destruction in Ukraine should ultimately bear the brunt of the reconstruction. Exactly how we do this, we will need to explore, we will need to have international consistency. So we continue to keep a close eye on the Canadian case to see how that plays out before we make any decisions about what actions we might take.
Good. Drew.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, can you tell us what the Wagner Group is?
The Wagner Group is it's defined itself as a private military company. I think most commonly regarded as a mercenary group.
And it's over a month since it was reported that the prescription of the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation was imminent. Can you tell us why there's such a delay in acting? Is it because it's a Home Office?
Sorry, that wasn't. Sorry, when you say reporting, I think there was speculation in the media, but there wasn't a
okay,
government statement.
Can you tell us the question's still valid?
Well, no, it's not valid because we didn't say we were going to, so there was no delay.
A fact. Foreign Secretary, it's
you can't delay something you didn't say you were going to do.
I didn't say that you'd said it. I said it was reported, which is a fact, that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Over a month ago, it was reported that this was going to be imminent. So let me just now ask the question of you: why is it taking so long to prescribe?
Well, no,
Foreign Secretary, I'll ask the question, then you can answer if that's all right. Yeah?
Okay.
Why is it taking so long to prescribe this organisation as a terrorist group?
We didn't say we were going to. So you
during his leadership campaign.
well, the government. He wasn't a member of the government. The government has not made the government has not made a commitment to do so. We do not speculate on future designations. You know that I've had this conversation with the committee and at the dispatch box before. The government has not committed to do that, but we always keep prescriptions of this organisation, any other organisation, under review. But your question is based on reporting or speculation as to what we might do, rather than any commitment from the government.
Let me ask you then, because you've heard, are you disassociating yourself from the Prime Minister's promise?
No, what I'm saying is the government's position...
Well, you are, yes.
No, the government's position has remained unchanged. If the government's position were to change, I would inform the committee. But the government's position
who's
is
the head of the government?
The Prime Minister is the head of the government.
So the Prime Minister said this would happen.
The Prime Minister didn't say this would happen. When he said that, he was a backbencher. The point is, there has not been a commitment from the government. You're asking me why we're delaying something that the government has not committed to do. So this is why I was pulling up on the question. The question was self-contradictory.
Let me get you out of that and change tack a wee bit. Is it your view that prescription would be a useful thing to do in terms of the operations of the Wagner Group, given their admitted responsibility for atrocities?
When you say my group, you mean as a government minister?
What's your view, yeah?
Well, as a government
minister, yeah.
The government minister is the government's position is unchanged on this, and if it changes, we'll let you know.
What does Wagner Group have to do to be prescribed?
Well, as I say, we don't speculate on the future nature of prescriptions. The point being is that no country has prescribed the Wagner Group. We will always keep prescriptions as an option, but as I say, we don't routinely speculate on which organisations might be prescribed.
Let me come back and
I'm not going to start doing so now.
Let me come back and try and get an answer to the question I actually asked you.
I answered the question you asked.
No, you didn't. I said, do you think it's a useful tool in terms of dealing with organisations like the Wagner Group?
Prescription can be a useful tool, but I comment on the fact that no country has done so, and the UK's current position is that we have not prescribed, but as I say, we don't speculate on future prescription designations.
What level of atrocities would have to be carried out before you did see it as a useful method?
Well, look, as I say, we don't speculate on future prescriptions. You're inviting me to speculate. I've just said we don't.
Thank you. Moving back to Russia very briefly, can I ask where we are with supporting Kara-Murza and the fact that he's being held hostage? Specifically, has he had any access to his family, and what medical support is he receiving?
Yes, We continue to call for the release of all those detained by Russian on political grounds, including Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Kara-Murza, Alexei Gorinov. We continue to be in contact with his family. Leo Doherty, who's the responsible minister for the region, has met with his family and will do so again in the near future. So we do continue to push for this. We do continue to make sure the Russian state knows that he and other individuals who are incarcerated are not going to be forgotten about. We are not going to ignore them, and we will keeping their names in the public domain so that Russia knows that it cannot do anything quietly behind the scenes.
Fine, thank you. Bob.
The government has said that channels for dialogue with Russia may be invigorated when the moment is right. Now, given our support for Ukraine, given everything that is going on at the moment, under what conditions would that moment be right? And can you tell us something about the nature of your communications with the Russian state currently?
So I have had no direct communications with the Russian state since becoming Foreign Secretary. We do, of course, still have some channels, but I'm uncomfortable speculating as to what the circumstances would be for two reasons. One, because I think it's very difficult meaningfully to try and predict all the the variable things that might happen during a conflict like the one we're seeing in Ukraine. And also, I think that the nature or the circumstances under which we would feel comfortable re-engaging with Russia, probably not ones that I would want to speculate in front of the committee.
No, but I mean, considering its nuclear arsenal, considering its permanent membership of the Security Council, do you accept the fact that whatever its behaviour, there is worth in having some kind of communication with it? And at what point do you start looking to the future, even if you're not trying to re-engage with the government, but to what extent is your ambassador in Moscow, who I think we're speaking to in about an hour, or the APPG on Russia is, to what extent can she be tasked with reaching out to people who have influence in that society, even if they are not, especially if they're not directly aligned with the regime?
Well, obviously, because of the circumstances, the actions of our ambassador in Moscow have been heavily curtailed. She's not able to perform the functions that you would normally expect an ambassador to perform. We do maintain some lines of potential communication. We are not routinely communicating with the Russian government and the Russian state. We do, of course, find ourselves sometimes co-located. I've been in the near proximity of the Russian foreign minister, both at the UN, at the G20 in India. So if the moment were right, there could be opportunities to engage. We would only do so if we believe that engagement was either to the meaningful benefit of the Ukrainian people as part of bringing this war to the right conclusion, or to avert some serious other incident that might otherwise. So to avoid misunderstandings or miscommunications, we would maintain these channels as open.
You're not talking to them because you're obviously political head, but there are potential communication routes which are still open and ongoing.
So we do still have an embassy. As I say, we do still have potential lines of communication, and of course we would not hesitate to use them to, as I say, avert misunderstanding or seize an opportunity to bring this war to a successful conclusion.
Can I just ask two very brief questions for clarity? Firstly, the US have described Wagner as a transnational criminal organisation, so they've given A designation. Wagner have no designation currently in this country in terms of being a terrorist group or transnational crime group or anything like that, are they? So they are undesignated, yeah?
Yeah, so as I say,
Okay.
no country has designated them as a terrorist organisation, as per the question that was asked.
Others have designated them as an international criminal organisation. We haven't gone down that route. Do we have that capacity to do that? Do we have that designation
Well, that's
in UK law?
I mean, My understanding, and I've not spoken in detail with this, with the American system, my understanding is that equates to a sanctions designation, which, and we sanction Wagner in its entirety. So I think it's the same, I think it's basically slightly different wording, but gets them to the same place as us.
Okay, thank you for that. And secondly, just on the Russian asset seizure, in the past we've said that, you know, we've frozen Russian sovereign assets. It is our intention to use those assets, to give those assets in some form to Ukraine, or to find a legal vehicle if the Russians don't voluntarily do so, because that's what we have certainly implied in the past. What progress is there now? You say you're looking at the Canadian example. What progress is there amongst G7 states about actually not only seizing state assets, but where's the process in handing them over to an international fund of some kind to support the Ukrainian reconstruction? Where are we with that?
So I don't have anything that I can describe as well advanced thinking either from the UK or from the wider G7. There are, of course, some very serious legal hurdles about the general principle of it's not healthy having states arbitrarily seizing assets and liquidating those assets. And so even though the cause is as clear, unambiguous and just as this, as I say, there are some very important international legal principles. We will continue to explore, whether through legal means, whether through sanctions routes or whatever it might be, to get the people that have done the damage to pay for the repair. It sounds easy. It's not as straightforward, which is why no country has come up with a silver bullet solution to this. But we will keep working. We will keep working to explore ways of making sure that the people who have done the damage pay for damage.
Eventually go back to them then.
Well, I mean, sanctions are not time limited. And as I say, there is the precedent for freezing assets, even for very, very, very extended period of time, is well tested. As I say, there is a difference between freezing and seizing. But look, we're not just going to shrug our shoulders and say it's difficult, so we're not going to try. We will continue investigating, as I say, in close coordination with our international allies.
Moving to the Orcas, then I'll come to Graham. Have we and our close allies got our posture right towards Vucic and Serbia?
Well, we've had Lord Peach, who is our envoy to the region, has had very clear and direct conversations with the Serbian leadership. We've made it completely clear that attacks against KFOR troops completely unacceptable, implying that KFOR was somehow involved in initiating the violence, completely unjustified. And I've spoken with the Kosovan Prime Minister. We are seeking to de-escalate this situation, and we do so by utilising the strong relationships we have with the leaders in the region. I genuinely pay tribute to Lord Peach, very, very enthusiastic, a regular visit to the region. I think he's been there over a dozen times just since I've become Foreign Secretary, and we're delivering those very clear and unambiguous messages to all the leaders involved.
There's a clear lack of balance, particularly in the US's messaging on what's happening in Kosovo the last 2 weeks. What's missing as well is if we truly believe we're going to de-escalate the situation, you have to call a spade, and yet I haven't seen us, the US or the EU, call out the armed militias in northern Syria, who were the foremost part of the protests. If there was any legitimate protesters, I would be surprised, who threw Molotov cocktails and shot at KFOR, who are armed and funded by Vucic and his Serbian forces, and if you don't support them and do what you're told, you find a grenade on your doorstep about to blow up your child. Why are we not calling out these armed militias?
We have made it clear directly. I mean, this thing, we do our diplomatic engagement face to face, and we have the standing in the region to do so. When we speak, the leaders in the region do listen. They don't always take our advice, which is frustrating, and we've seen some of the repercussions of that. We have made it very clear that we expect the demilitarization of those groups in the North Kosovo area and the border region. We've had that conversation directly.
The problem is that we're not doing it publicly. So publicly, the US has used a very sharp stick with the Kosovans and really gone for them. I don't think it's a particularly fair group of sanctions to say you are no longer welcome in DC. We will not help you anymore with recognition. And by the way, you're out of that training exercise about to take place. But no public criticism of the armed militias and the fact that they are Serbia funded?
Well, look, and there is a balance, and this is it's a legitimate observation, but there is a balance. Sometimes doing diplomacy directly and privately can be most effective. There needs sometimes to be a route to escalation. If that doesn't work, you do need somewhere to go. And I sometimes feel there is a desire to always go loud and public at the start, rather than have that as a position you can escalate to. As I say, the UK has real standing in the region. And when we speak with authority. As I say, it doesn't always mean we are listened to, but we do speak with a real authority. Lord Peach has had conversations directly with, and we will continue to do so. And we want to demonstrate that a route of de-escalation, of engagement between Serbia and Kosovo, dialogue, rather than violence, is the way forward. That will be our position. Of course, we always reserve the right to change our posture and our response based on circumstances. At the moment, my view is the best way of doing this is utilising the strong relationship that Lord Peach has built over decades to try and drive change.
And then as I pass on, I would just urge that given the US and the EU are being completely unbalanced on this and have used a very loud voice against Kosovo and none against Serbia, that is where the UK's role does come in, because you cannot have accountability or peace if there is a deep imbalance in the way that we've seen over the last few weeks. Graham.
Thanks. What impact do you think the cut of 97.5% of £250 million aid budget to the Sudan has had on the civil war in Sudan?
I think the drivers of the current escalation in conflict were probably independent of that. Of course, we would like nothing more. I would like nothing more to have a bigger budget. As I say, I don't think there'll be any sector of state in any government of any persuasion that would like more money. The drivers of the most recent escalation in violence are multiple. I was about to say multiple and complicated. Sadly, they're not terribly complicated. But I don't think there can be a line drawn between our ODA expenditure in the region and that conflict, because of course there is still ODA money being spent, less from ourselves but by other countries. So I'm unconvinced that putting more money in whatever format into the region would have prevented this current escalation of violence.
Yeah. I think any reasonable person would accept there were other major drivers of the civil war. But are you really saying that to remove nearly £250 million worth of aid has not affected in any way what's happening in Sudan?
So I think this most recent escalation in violence has been driven by other factors. There, as I say, whilst we've reduced, other countries have increased, and look, I would love to think that we are so very influential that even though other countries were still pinging ODA money into Sudan, that this was that we were so influential that our reduction in expenditure offset theirs. But that doesn't strike me as a credible argument. The friction between the two generals, I think, is independent of our ODA expenditure. We will, of course, continue to work with international partners, both in the region and within Africa and within the region, to try and bring a permanent, sustained peace and dialogue between the two generals. But as I say, I can't see there's any connection between our aid expenditure and this conflict.
I mean, everybody wants peace. Every reasonable person wants peace in Sudan. But there has been criticism of the United Kingdom and the Security Council putting too much faith in the Sudan transition process and not enough in the security of people in Sudan. What is your response to that criticism? People feel that process hasn't been working and won't work, and there should be another focus.
Well, look, I mean, the simple truth is that there has been a lot of effort, both from from regional bodies like the AU and multilateral organisations, to try and drive a sustainable peace. The negotiations had appeared to be progressing, and the sudden, very, very sudden breakdown in talks and escalation of violence, I think, was a shock to many in the international stage. I think trying to understand, the people that say that we need to do more to protect the Sudanese people, how that might manifest itself. This is not a permissive environment at the moment. We're not in a position where peacekeepers could go in. We need to get the two generals who are the key counterparties here back around the negotiating table and bring in sustainable peace. That could then facilitate other work, but I can't see that there is capacity in the international community to inject a security force into Sudan in the circumstances that we currently see.
Right. I'll come back to the intelligence. Dominic Raab, your predecessor, had a pretty torrid time at this committee after the evacuation of Afghanistan, as did the permanent Undersecretary. Have you read our report?
Yeah.
Can you tell me, having read the report, how we did better and worse in the evacuation in Sudan when the civil war broke out?
Well, look,
in terms of lessons learned, what lessons were learned and what improved?
So there were a number of points. I'm not going to be able to get them all because it was a comprehensive document, and I think it was a thoughtful document. Didn't agree with all of it, but I think it was a thoughtful, important document. So our capacity in the crisis response centre was one of the things that we've changed. We made it much clearer in terms of crisis leadership, in terms of the gold, silver, bronze. The functionality within the crisis centre and the decision making across government, including the use of Cobra. In terms of what went better, I think it is clear that the evacuation from Sudan was discharged better than the evacuation from Afghanistan. Although I would say the circumstances were very different. So you should be careful drawing too many comparisons one to the other. But we conducted the largest and longest evacuation operation of any of the Western nations that had people in Sudan. I think, coordinated very, very closely, again, with regional leadership, both with the African Union and, of course, with Saudi Arabia, so that people could go from Port Sudan to Jeddah. We coordinated very closely with other countries to facilitate the evacuation where we were able to of their nationals, both in the initial under fire evacuation of our embassy staff and the embassy staff of a couple of other countries, but also the longer evacuation of British nationals and their Sudanese dependents.
In response to that report, the Foreign Office said decisions should be clearly made and communicated in advance of any future evacuations about eligibility for evacuation. Why then did eligibility criteria for evacuation from the Sudan change, and why was the main form of communication via email when the internet was pretty often not there? It was down a lot of the time.
Well, we were able to change our criteria because we were able to extend the duration of our evacuation flight. When we first went in there, you've got to remember the ceasefire, which was never a particularly strong ceasefire, was a time-limited ceasefire. And of course, what we did was prioritise the people who we felt we had the strongest responsibility for, which was British nationals and their immediate dependents, particularly those vulnerable. So we prioritised them as it became clear that through the work of the international community, and I pay particular tribute to Tony Blinken, the United States of America, for facilitating talks which extended the ceasefire. We were able to keep the airhead open for longer, which gave us more flexibility, and we were able to evacuate more people and extend the criteria. So the extension of the criteria was a byproduct of relatively good news, but it was absolutely right that we prioritised British nationals and their immediate dependents when we thought that we had a very, very limited window of opportunity.
Thanks. You said previously, and I said I would come back to it, that the start of this war, the two generals falling out, wasn't foreseeable and predictable. Minister Mitchell told this committee that, exactly that, which is one of the reasons why there's a certain level of failure and lack of senior staff in Khartoum.
Sorry, when you mean failure, what do you mean by that? Because I disagree.
You think everything was perfect, even though
no, I didn't say.
communication...
Well, what do you mean by a certain failure?
As Chris said before, I will try and clarify it in a second, but it's normal for members of the committee to ask questions of ministers when they're here. There were certain difficulties getting people who weren't British nationals but who had UK residency out when their partners were leaving. There were difficulties there. There were difficulties about communication. There were difficulties getting to the air bases. They're well documented. But the question I wanted to ask was, while you said it and Minister Mitchell said it, that there were problems with early warning systems. Former British Ambassador to Sudan and other people have said this was predictable. Does that mean there is something wrong with the Foreign Office's early warning systems?
So I'm going to go back to the implied question that you made in the preamble to the specific question about difficulties. The point is we had to make decisions about prioritisation, and we had to communicate in an environment where electricity was unpredictable, where the internet was unpredictable, where mobile phone signal was unpredictable. So we communicated. I mean, you said that we relied on email. We didn't rely on email. We used all available means of communications throughout the evacuation. So we always communicated on multiple channels because we knew that no one channel could be relied upon. So the difficulties were inherent within the situation, and they weren't performance difficulties by the FCDO. When it comes, you said there were difficulties with non-British nationals. Again, they weren't difficulties; they were decisions that we made to prioritise British nationals and their immediate families. And as I said, as it became clear, we could evacuate more people than was originally thought, because the international community, led by the United States, were able to extend the period of ceasefire. We were able to extend the criteria. These were difficulties, these were choices. We took advantage of opportunities as they presented themselves to do more than our original planning had envisaged, because we had more time than our original planning had envisaged. And again, when you said there were difficulties in the leadership, and the reason I wanted to push back on that is because the heads of mission routinely leave the country for various times, whether it be on leave, whether it comes to conferences, whether it's going to regional events. That is not unusual. We have a well-established chain of command, and the number 2 in Khartoum, when the HMA was out, was the development director. The development director took command of the situation in countries. There were no difficulties with the chain of command, and indeed, having the HMA able to plug into the crisis response centre here in King Charles Street actually proved to be a real advantage. So I just want to nail down those implied questions that you laid out before you asked your specific question. And when it came to predicting, there are always tensions in terms of negotiations like this. But there was no country in the world, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who have got very, very, very good links into Sudan. There was no country in the world that predicted this particular escalation at this particular time. Indeed, there was a Saudi aircraft on the ground that was destroyed with the fighting. If the Saudis had predicted it, that aeroplane would not have been there. The fact is, there are always tensions, and saying, "Oh, this could break down," is not predicting. The particular nature and timing of the breakdown. So whilst there are always tensions in the negotiations, basically no one, not the UK, not the US, not the Saudis, not anybody, predicted the scale of the escalation at this particular point in time.
Thank you.
Going to Liam, please.
Thanks. When it comes to rebuilding Sudan, our latitude is going to be constrained because the Home Office is taking so much money out of your budget. You said all Secretaries of State wanted more, but your budget is smaller because the Home Office is using ODA to fund accommodation costs and other costs for those seeking asylum in this country. Can you just confirm to the committee how much the Home Office is taking from your budget in ODA this year?
So I'm going to push back on the language you use in the question. ODA, so we don't define how ODA is spent. The definition of ODA expenditure is an international one, and we abide by that, and we are comfortable to work.
But you'll know
within the
some
confines of
countries
that.
don't take money out of ODA, for example, to support those seeking asylum in their own country.
So the
Australia, for example.
So the definition of ODA is internationally recognised, and we are not going to try and redefine it. Refugees in the UK is an internationally recognised. Refugees in the ODA expending country is an internationally recognised and appropriate use. So when you spend money, we don't say we're spending.
I remember some of this as the immigration minister for 2 years.
Let me finish.
The question, just because the interest of time is so short,
for the benefit of the rest of the committee,
is how much money the Home Office is taking out of the budget this year.
So the point is, so you keep using the taking out of the budget. The point is
using.
So the point is, we don't define what is or is not ODA expenditure. We spend money on what we spend money on. The definition is external. Spending money on hosting refugees in the UK is legitimate government expenditure. Of course, it is having an implication on our ability to, within a limited ODA pot, expend elsewhere. I recognise that. Of course, I would love to spend more money, but the expenditure domestically on refugees, I'm sure you agree, is a legitimate ODA expenditure.
How much is it?
So I will double check the most up to date figures, but my understanding it is 1.7 billion in the financial year 22-23.
Okay, so would it not help us to find other ways to increase our overseas development budget, given the pressures that we've got? 1.7 billion of pressures, for example.
Oh, we are. That's why the Prime Minister is committed to growing the economy, because obviously 0.5 of a larger quantum is a larger budget. So that is why growing the UK economy is so important. We've also said that our aspiration is to go back up to 0.7% of GNI once the economic situation improves, again, which is why it's so important that we deliver on our promise to the British people.
But why don't we match Japan's commitment to recycle 40% of the 19 billion in special drawing rights that we got from the IMF?
Well, look, the quantum of our ODA expenditure has been decided by government. That's decided at 0.5% of GNI. We want to make sure that we drive down the pressure on domestic refugee hosting by making sure the countries that people leave are safer, and that includes, of course, bringing the war in Ukraine to a conclusion. But if we spend, the money somewhere, it's got to come from somewhere else.
So the special drawing rights are sitting in the exchange equalisation account in the Treasury, and
it's still money, and it's still ultimately.
But you can't use it for anything else, and it's 19 billion.
I disagree. You can't use it for anything.
You can't use SDRs for anything else.
So you can only use SDRs on
they can either sit in the exchange equalisation account, or you can, as you know, recycle them, because you've recycled 20%. So my question is, why have you taken a decision to recycle 20% and not 40% like Japan, or indeed 25% like France, or indeed 25% like China? Why have you come up with this magic number of 20%?
Well, the process that I went through with both, actually, when I was the minister with the lead for development, prior to becoming Foreign Secretary in the exercise that I went through with Andrew Mitchell, balances our international commitments. I don't have the extensive folder full of spreadsheets that underpin the decision making on that. But the point is that the idea that somehow there's this free pot of money, implicit in your question is this free pot of painless money that we could apply to this but choose not to, is just not accurate. All money has to come from somewhere, and there's always an opportunity cost to any expenditure. What we want to do is we want to grow the British economy so that we can get back up to the 0.7% of GNI, and also until we get to that increase to 0.7, once we sit at not less than 0.5, we want to make sure that 0.5 is of a bigger figure. Either way, our incentive is to grow the economy.
So at President Macron's summit next week in Paris, what proposals are we tabling to grow the size of the development pie globally?
Well, I don't want to preempt the negotiations that will be happening at that summit. But the point is, the best way of being more generous internationally is to grow the size of the economy. I'm very proud that under this government, even in our most constrained year, we were able to put a higher percentage of GNI than under any Labour government. So in our worst year, we did better than the previous Labour government's best year. So I'm very proud of that. But the best way of doing even more still is to grow the economy. And everything circles back sustainably to grow the economy, and that's why we're focusing on that.
Actually, you could match what Japan's doing. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Neil.
Thanks, Jeff.
Sorry, Neil.
150 Palestinians and 20 Israelis died last year alone, in part due to tensions over settlement expansions. Can you just talk us through what steps you're taking to stop Israel annexing further land in the occupied West Bank?
Well, our conversations with Israel have made it clear that we oppose any actions which potentially undermine a sustainable two-state solution. That includes settlement expansions. I've raised that directly with my Israeli interlocutor, and I know that that message has been passed across a number of channels across government.
So that's a conversation, but what meaningful initiatives are you working on to de-escalate the conflict?
Well, conversations, diplomacy is meaningful initiatives. That's how much change is derived in the world. And we do work, as I say, both directly with Israel. We work in coordination with other international partners. We have, as I say, a very good relationship both with Israel and other countries in the region and beyond. And we are consistent in our message that we want a sustainable, peaceful two-state solution that sees a home for both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. We will support activity or initiatives that support that agenda, and we will oppose those that potentially undermine it. And we've had this conversation. I have had this conversation directly. We don't believe that settlement expansion supports that agenda. That's why we have said we oppose it.
Why is the UK government opposing the ICJ referral on the issue? What's the basis for the UK position on that?
Because I don't believe that that is the most effective way of driving change in this. The conversations that we have had, and there have been, you'll remember, a number of occasions in the past where there has been talk of or commitment to settlement expansion, and through diplomacy, through negotiation, we've prevented those expansions, and we will continue to seek to do so.
But the difference is the Israeli government now has the coalition now has a commitment to expand. Would you consider action against British companies who are either demolishing even UK aid-built support for Palestinian refugees in particular, but also engaged in building illegally for Israeli settlements?
So when you say British companies that have been...
Yeah, involved in demolition of existing Palestinian facilities on Palestinian land or in building Israeli settlements in disputed or occupied territory?
Well, our position on trading with Israel and companies, UK-based companies or UK companies that trade with Israel are able to do so. Ultimately, as I say, our position is that we feel that settlements expansions is detrimental ultimately to the desire for a sustainable two-state solution. That continues to be our position.
What is there to stop the public concluding? We had Sir Chris touched on Mantrack earlier. 5 million donations to the Conservative Party and no action against Mantrack, profiteering from illegal war. And again here, JCB, 5 million donations to the Conservative Party, involved in building Israeli settlements. No action from the UK government. What's to stop the public concluding that £5 million donation allows a blind eye from government?
If you're making a specific accusation, make it.
I just did, I think.
Well, in which case, all the donations to the party. Look, I'm here as a government minister rather than a spokesperson for the Conservative Party, but were the party chairman here, he, I'm sure, would say that all the donations to the Conservative Party are done in full accordance with the Electoral Commission law, in full transparency. And if you are making an accusation of bribery in any way, then please do so. I'd be very interested to hear you actually say it rather than just imply it.
I'm asking, because you said that you have these conversations, I'm asking for what action you're taking against those who are pursuing the expansion and annexation of settlements. And you're saying you're having a conversation, but I'm seeing no action. I'm just exploring why there might be no action.
So you're saying they're seeing no action. I've made the point that on a number of occasions where there has been well-advanced talks about settlement expansion through diplomacy, you can shake your head all you like, but through diplomacy,
Yeah, I don't think it's bearing any fruit at all, so if you want to move on, please do.
Through diplomacy, we have prevented those expansions from happening, because that is how diplomacy works. We don't always get away in every instance, but that is how diplomacy works. And
We've only got 8 minutes to go.
We will continue to engage to try and drive a positive change both in this region and more broadly
I'm going to bring in
world.
Royston now. Royston, please.
Chairman, quick question, Foreign Secretary, if I may. 1975, the signing of the Madrid Accords ended the Spanish presence in modern-day Morocco, but still the Western Sahara is contested. Does the UK support Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara? If not, why not? And if so, when publicly?
So we our position on this is that we do not recognise the Moroccan claim to the Western Sahara. We enjoy a very, very good bilateral relationship with Morocco. This is an issue that I've discussed with the Moroccan Foreign Minister on a number of occasions. So our position is unchanged. Ultimately, we want to see this, as is the case with a number of other issues around the world, we want to see this resolved through dialogue and negotiation, and we will always seek to encourage dialogue and negotiation. But that remains the UK government position.
Foreign Secretary, is it the government's position still that we support self-determination over the future of sovereignty of our British overseas territories, such as Gibraltar and the Falklands?
Well, yeah. So our position on those overseas territories has remained the same. I've made the point specifically with regard to the Falklands recently, after Argentina unilaterally withdrew from an agreement around this. But our position on this remains unchanged.
So if the position of the British government, which I would argue correctly, is for self-determination over the future sovereignty of overseas territories like Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, Bermudas, Cayman Islands and others, why is that not the case for the British overseas, for the British Indian overseas territory?
So we, as you all know, there have been ongoing proceedings, legal proceedings with regard to the definition of sovereignty of British Indian overseas territories. You will know we are in negotiations with Mauritius to try and resolve this in a way that protects all the things that we need to protect. And the UK's government position is that this is incredibly important to us. That we abide by international law, and that is why that's why we're discussing with the government of Mauritius a sustainable solution to what is currently a disagreement.
And just very briefly, finally, are you aware one of those protections that I know the FCDO talks about is countering Chinese growing influence in the Indian Ocean? Are you aware that the Mauritian government has recently chartered a Chinese vessel to transport between Mauritius and one of the outer islands of the British Indian Ocean Territory, Paris-Banas?
I have heard reports of that, and this is why, more broadly, looping back round to the initial questions that the committee posed, this is why our increased focus on the Indo-Pacific is incredibly important. We actually enjoy a good bilateral relationship with Mauritius. We want to make sure that they don't find themselves, as other countries have done, in a relationship, a debt relationship with China that unbalances their sovereign governmental decision making. But we will continue to make sure that through these negotiations we stay very, very clearly focused on the both the immediate geographical and the wider geopolitical issues which we seek to protect. I can give you and the committee assurances on that.
Drew.
Thank you. The US Inflation Reduction Act subsidies are presenting clear opportunities in the hydrogen economy. We know that the EU is working hard just now to access the supply chain there. Scotland has a rapidly developing hydrogen industry. What specific work have you and the Prime Minister done to ensure that Scottish industry can access that?
So I've discussed UK-US trading, including Scotland, on trips to the United States of America. I'm very proud of the fact that I'm Scotland's Foreign Secretary. I'm very passionate about promoting Scottish business, Scottish innovation, Scottish
specifically
technology.
On this, though, specifically on the hydrogen opportunity, have you done any work there?
So I have raised business opportunities with Scotland. So not exclusively about hydrogen.
So not specifically on that, but have you had any discussions with Scottish Government ministers about taking this forward?
So I have. I had a meeting. When was it? It was a while back now with Angus Robertson about promoting of Scotland overseas. And so I'm very, very proud to do it.
And the hydrogen economy specifically.
It's an important part of the job that I do. So renewable energy and renewable energy technologies are something I discuss regularly, not just with the United States of America, but with countries around the world.
One final question. You said you had a discussion with Angus Robertson. When was that?
I need to double check my diary, but it was a while back now. Was it tail end of last year or about this year?
Last year.
Was it last year?
No, I'm asking you, was it last year?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to ask about India and the arrest of Rashid Ghanouchi and other people in the Ennahda movement. I'm really concerned about the attack on political pluralism and trampling on the democratic rights in the constitution that came about after the Arab Spring. Just very simply, what is the FCDO doing to get Rashid Ghanouchi released from prison and other members of the Ennahda movement?
So again, I mean, Tunisia looked as if it might be the good news story from the Arab Spring. It is disappointing to see the progress they have been making slipping backwards. We have engaged. I'll double check when the most recent engagement is on that. I don't have the detail. It would have been done. It's not something I've raised personally with them, but I know this is something we feel strongly about. And of course, we want to see pluralism. We want to see democracy, meaningful democracy in Tunisia. We'll continue to push for that.
Neil.
Thanks, Jeff. And can you explain what concerns the Foreign Office or British High Commission have raised with the Sierra Leone government about imminent elections there?
Sorry, I was distracted. I missed the question.
The fast approaching elections in Sierra Leone, and in your letter to the committee you said where there are concerns you've raised them with the Sierra Leone government. What concerns have been raised?
Well, I've had direct exchange with the president of Sierra Leone, reinforcing our desire to see open, free and fair elections in Sierra Leone. I think since the time of military government in Sierra Leone, there has been a move towards democracy, but I wanted to make it clear that we are watching, that we want the best for Sierra Leone, but that we do expect free, open and fair elections in Sierra Leone. So I've done that directly, and I know this is a conversation that is echoed at High Commission level.
And did those conversations include issues about registration, intimidation of voters, anything specific, or were they more generally about retaining democracy?
So I can double check on the nature of the conversation. This conversation we have regularly. So the High Commissioner had conversations on these issues when I visited Sierra Leone. I had the conversations on these issues directly with the Sierra Leonean government, and as I say, I've exchanged communications with the Sierra Leone President reinforcing this.
But our letter raised some specific concerns. If you could go back and look at what the discussions entailed and then send back, because your reply didn't cover any of the specifics, so just be interested to hear.
Well, as I say, I was telling you what I directly have done. I'll double check on what specific points have been raised by the High Commissioner. Obviously, High Commissioners, because they have a more regular interaction with our interlocutors, will go into more detail than I will do at Foreign Secretary level. But I have raised our focus on democracy in Sierra Leone directly with the President.
Okay, look forward to receiving further correspondence. But then I wanted to ask about this fraud against the Foreign Office in Sierra Leone. So £2 million going missing in the context of dwindling budget, and perhaps you can talk us through how this has been even possible to occur.
Yeah, so it's still being investigated. Obviously, we have missions around the world in countries with different practices, and some of those have corrupt practices. This was clearly a case where individuals working for us were corruptly selling fuel which they shouldn't have been. We've now spotted it. We're looking at exactly what happened and what that tells us about our controls around the world. I wrote to the chair, as you know, in advance of it appearing in our annual accounts. Any fraud is regrettable, and we're determined to find out exactly what happened and any lessons we need to draw more widely across the network.
And what is stopping this happening again in Sierra Leone? And does it not, resound the alarm about the undermining of democracy and rule of law in that country by the governing party potentially?
I don't think it necessarily draws any lessons for wider politics or governance in Sierra Leone.
You were saying this is specific to individuals within the Foreign Office's staff?
This case was specific to individuals in the High Commission, yes.
Chris.
A couple of quick ones. First of all, thanks very much for what Andrew Mitchell said about the new anti-gay law in Uganda, and I presume that you completely endorse that. It was just choosing which minister to say it, yeah?
Look, he's the Minister for Africa, and
indeed.
so he said it. I raised it directly when I last met the Ugandan High Commissioner as well.
Grand, thanks very much. Can you confirm, have we been funding the Interreligious Council in Uganda? You might not be across the details. If you haven't, could you just write to us to tell us how much?
So I will double check on that.
Let's not get it half right. If you could write to us, that'd be great. Just because obviously it will be distressing for a lot of people to think that we've been funding a profoundly homophobic organisation in Uganda for the last few years. So it'd be nice to know how much money we've been given if we have, and if we haven't, then we can cross that off. Different one. The Gulf Strategy Fund. As I understand it, we doubled the amount of money going to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain last year. Some of that money is going to the Ministry of Interior Ombudsman, but there are lots of allegations that they have been deliberately covering up torture in Bahrain. Why on earth would we be giving money to Bahrain to do that?
Well, we are building capacity to make sure that the legal functions in Bahrain and other countries in the region improve. And actually, we have seen significant changes, particularly with regard to the use of non-custodial sentences, particularly with regards to people under the age of 18. So we have seen improvements that have been made. I raise the issue of human rights regularly with my Gulf counterparts.
When did you last do so?
Again, I'd need to double check.
Can you just send us a list of the times when you've raised human rights issues with Gulf states leaders? That'd be great if you could.
I can do, but to make the point, this is a regular part of the conversations that I have. So,
Sure. It's
so
just be good to have it all on the record, that's all.
So typically it would be in a vast majority of the interactions I have with my Gulf counterparts.
And final one from me. The last set of transparency returns that the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office returned was for up until last September.
Mm-hmm.
You're now nearly 6 months late. Why is that? And why is the Foreign Office nearly always the office that's... You're meant to do it within 3 months of the date concerned. So for instance, there are no transparency returns about your time as in the Foreign Office yet.
I'll look into that.
Let me look at it.
Yeah,
And you're nearly always the last department. And the Leader of the House has said that you're meant to be doing it within a month by the summer recess. So it'd be good to see how you're going to get on with that.
I will look to see. I will look to see what happens with that. I mean, I would imagine that by the nature of international travel and the nature of our job, our returns might be more complicated than other government departments. But I will look into that. I'd prefer to be best in class.
And final two, Foreign Secretary, what is your assessment of the ongoing normalisation of Assad? And also, connected to that question, Asma al-Assad, which is obviously the wife of Bashir, her father is a known captagon smuggler here in the UK, and yet there seems to be no effort to make sure that captagon doesn't make its way to the UK, particularly given that Afghanistan, now the opium is being raised to the ground. What are we doing to stop captain coming here, but also to sanction people like the Assad regime and his family who are still here operating on British soil and travelling to Syria at least every other week?
I'm uncomfortable about speaking specifically about individuals, but I have raised the decision by the Arab League to readmit Syria. I had extensive conversations with a number of my Arab interlocutors in the weeks and months leading up to that. I knew this was something that they were considering. I think the decision is largely, actually I shouldn't put words in their mouth, but I know that some of the pressure of Syrian refugees in the region is part of that. And I think there is a desire or a belief that it's better to price Syria away from Russia, for example. I've made it clear that we are uncomfortable with that. Obviously, it is not our decision to make, it's the Arab League decision. The UK's posture has not changed. I recognise some of the drivers for that decision, even though I don't necessarily agree with them and certainly don't like the decision. And we will continue working with our partners in the region to try and drive stability in Syria. Obviously, in the Syrian border regions, particularly the west, where it borders onto Lebanon, and particularly the north, where it borders onto Turkey and Iraq. These are challenges. It's an incredibly difficult file, and one that I spend a lot of my time working on. But as I say, the UK's position remains consistent, and we will encourage our partners in the region not to allow Syria's reintroduction to blind them to some of the changes that Syria and the Assad regime really needs to drive.
Sure. And I'll leave that request, Asma al-Assad's father, with you.
Absolutely make a note of that.
And very final, is the Foreign Office resisting, holding up, refusing to allow the prescription of the IRGC, which we understand the Home Office wants to do? And as part of that, can you also assure us as to the position of Morad Tabaz, who remains held illegally by the Iranian government, whose health we're gravely concerned about as a committee?
So the second point first. We continue, as we always do, we continue to work to get the full release of those people illegitimately detained in Iran. This is a conversation that I've had with the United States of America, and we continue to have with the Iranian regime, and the protection of British nationals overseas will always remain a priority for the UK. With regard to prescription, decisions about prescription are always a cross-government decision. Government speaks with one voice, and unless the government position changes, the government's position at the moment is that we have not prescribed the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. As I said in response to other questions on this, we keep these issues constantly under review, and if the government's position were to change, then the government would then speak with one voice about this changed position. As it stands at the moment, the government...
So if the Foreign
government
Office was
position-
to give it the green flag, would the government's position change?
So decisions made across government on this, and I'm not going to get into where people are, because discussions within government are best kept within government until decisions are made, then they are communicated as a single voice.
All right, well, I think this committee probably puts a strong request to the Foreign Office to give a green light to IRGC prescription. Can I give you both our thanks for coming before us today and for giving up your time, and we will write to you on a few issues that were raised today, but thank you both ever so much. Order at the end of this session.